Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming to this presentation this morning. This is Canonical Questions with Dr. Ben Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen is both a civil lawyer and a pontifically licensed canon lawyer in the Roman Catholic Church. He currently serves as the Assistant Vice President and Dean of Students at the University of St. Thomas in Houston and is an adjunct professor of canon law at St. Mary's Seminary in Houston. He is also an adjunct professor for the Avila Institute of Spiritual Formation and serves on the Board of Governors for the Canon Law Society of America. He has held numerous positions in Roman Catholic dioceses for over 20 years. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in liturgical musicology from the University of Kansas, a Master of Theological Studies from the University of Dallas, Pontifical Licentiate degree in canon law from the Catholic University of America, and a Doctorate of Jurisprudence Law degree from the Hamline University School of Law. He is currently completing 2 additional doctoral degrees, one in ministry in biblical exposition from the Noshoda House, and a Doctor of Education from the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Nguyen and his wife Beth have been married for 29 years and have 5 children and 5 grandchildren. So please welcome Dr. Nguyen.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me back at St. Augustine's. It's always a pleasure to come back to St. Augustine and see all of the vibrant life that is here. Let's start with a word of prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Oh, Heavenly Father, we give you thanks and praise for the day that you have given us. We thank you, O Lord, for all the good gifts that you have bestowed upon us. In a special way, O Lord, we ask mercy for our sins, and we ask, O Lord, that you bless the work of our hands, that you bless our community, that you bless and help us to spread your faith, spread the faith in you, all for the glory of your Son's name. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, great. What we're going to do in the time that we have, we'll open it up for a little bit of an open Q&A here in a second. But I wanted just to give a little bit of an introduction on a topic that a lot of people may not have thought about much, and that's the notion of canon law. Canon law. Canon law seems to have a lot of misunderstanding these days. Canon law usually has a lot of people thinking and assuming it's one thing, but it may be something else. So what I'd like to look at just briefly as an intro is to look at what exactly is canon law. Let's look at some of the misunderstandings that people have about canon law. And then after that, we'll open it up for a little bit of Q&A on different canonical topics. So the first question that we'll look at is, what exactly is canon law? Is it something that the church imposes upon people? Is it something that is just an extra add-on to the gospel? Is it something that is just at the whim of whoever the church leaders are? And I think to answer that question, we have to get back to a little bit of basics, which is, what is the nature of the church? Canon law would not make any sense in the life of the church if we don't understand exactly what the church is. And sometimes misunderstandings about canon law flows from a misunderstanding of what the church is. What is the church? If the church is what we claim it is, if the church is what God, Jesus, has established on earth as his body, then what is this nature of the church? As Catholics, we believe, and we see in places like Matthew 16:18, Matthew 18:18, pretty explicit references to the church. St. Paul references the church as the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12. He speaks about the church in so many other contexts as well. So what is the church? The church, we claim, is that visible body of the called out ones, of the called out ones. And what do we mean by the called out ones? If you go back to the Greek version of the Old Testament that Jesus and his disciples were using at the time, it's a version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which is a translation into Greek of the what we would call the Old Testament books. And in the Septuagint, particularly in the book of Exodus, the people of God, the Hebrew people who were enslaved in Egypt, were referred to as the called out ones. They're being called out of Egypt and into the promised land, called out of sin and death, called out of that slavery and into that newness of life. Interestingly enough, in Greek, the word for the called out one is ekklesia. Ecclesia, coming from the Greek word kletos, which is called, ek, meaning going out. Ecclesia are the ones who are being called out, the ones who are being brought out. And so that becomes the root of the Latin word, even ecclesia, which we know means church. Now, in English, the word church comes from the German, but in almost every other Romance language and other ancient languages as well, ecclesia is the word for church. And if seeing that, we go to the New Testament and we see that St. Paul talks about those who are called. When we look through the New Testament and we look at it with the controversy and things like that, we don't realize that the number one word and term that St. Paul uses to refer to that body of Christ is kletos, those who are called. We who are called, where we get the word ecclesia from. So if there is this ecclesia that's called out, what's going on in that ecclesia? What's going on in that group? Well, there's certain things for our purposes. Well, we know sacramentally, that's the receptacle. That's the place where the grace of the Paschal mystery is being dispensed. The church dispenses the sacraments and starts to call people out through baptism, through confirmation, through confession and communion, and all the sacraments becomes applications, become places where people are being called out through the grace of the Paschal mystery being applied. For our purposes, though, this called out ones has a couple of implications. Implication number one is that the called out ones is a visible body. It's a visible body. This is a huge disagreement. When the reformers broke from the church, they said, no, the church is just those who believe. We say, no. The church is not only just those who believe, but is a visible body that God has left on earth. You have to be able to see the church, that there is an institutional aspect to it, that there is a visible aspect to it. In other words, some groups who are claiming to be Christians say that the church is an invisible reality, just those who believe. Well, we say, no, the church is God's visible sign on earth. That is the sign and the instrument of our salvation. If it's a visible society, then it has certain implications. In a visible society, particularly a visible society that is comprised of those who are imperfect yet, those who are being called, those like us who are being worked on and sanctified and all that, if that's the case, that means that there's relationships within the people. And if there's relationships among the people, there become a necessity of having to regulate those relationships. In other words, that's where law comes in. Law comes in that we regulate our relationships so that the society, whatever that society that's being regulated is, can become truly what it's supposed to be. That's what we call in social ethics and social theology, social doctrine, the common good. When you do what you can, those aspects that allows this group, this visible body, to truly be the body of Christ. Let me give you an example to put it in the practical. If, according to, for example, Canon 843, everybody has the right to the sacraments, when is that right limited? Is it an unlimited right? Is it a time where I can do anything and whatever I want? I can knock on Father John's door at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, hey, confirm me right now. I have the right to the sacraments. That creates difficult relationships that are there. It creates relationships that can be strained. And so the church, in her mercy, as a visible society, comes together and says, hey, we need to regulate this so that the gospel can happen, so that the gospel can flourish, so that these relationships can help us be what we're truly supposed to be. That's the notion of canon law. Canon law regulates the body of Christ so that we can truly become the body of Christ, so that grace and charisms can flourish, so that grace can be dispensed within the church. Let me give you another practical example. Another practical example would be this. If Jesus said in John 6, this is my body, that you must eat of my body and drink my blood, if not, you don't have life eternal in you, that's a pretty serious saying. So presuming the reality of the Eucharist then, we have to know, hey, at what point is that no longer bread? What do we have to do to make sure that that's the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ? Because to miss it on that is going to be to miss it in some really serious ways. And so the church has the authority then. Christ gives the church the authority to say, hey, you have to discern and officially lay out what it is, how it is that we can say this is no longer bread at this point. And so the church comes out with regulations that said, hey, it has to be, at least for the Latin church, unleavened bread. It has to be wheat bread. We start laying down principles by which, hey, this is now the Eucharist. If baptism truly is a death and resurrection in Jesus Christ, a recreation, a washing away of original sin, that's pretty serious stuff. What is necessary for a valid baptism then? At what point can we say somebody's truly baptized? It necessitates that we have regulations. That's where canon law starts to spring up. Canon law is that service to the gospel so that we can regulate our relationships with each other in the church so that things can happen. And that's not me talking here. Listen to what John Paul II says. In 1983, when John Paul II promulgated the current set of legislation, the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which is the one that we use today, and there's a whole history of canon law, how it was done. The first codification was in 1917. And so after the Second Vatican Council, there was a thought that we need to kind of regulate here or rethink how we do certain things in light of the gospel, in light of the council. And so there was drafting that was done all through the 70s. And in 1983, John Paul II promulgated the current Code of Canon Law. And in the promulgation document, what he wrote was this, that there's always a document at the beginning. So he wrote an apostolic constitution promulgating the 1983 Code of Canon Law, and he gives a short reflection on not only the history of this, but on the nature of law. And this is what he says. He says, the code, meaning canon law itself, is in no way intended as a substitute for faith, charism, grace, and especially charity in the life of the church. He goes to one of the misconceptions about canon law, is that law replaces charisms and all these things. And he said, no, the code is not intended to replace these things. On the contrary, the purpose is rather to create an order in the ecclesial society that, while still assigning primacy of love, grace, and charity, at the same time renders their organic development easier in the life of both the ecclesial society and the individual persons who belong in it. Now, I know like me, you probably thought, okay, I got the beginning of that, but then John Paul just keeps kind of going and going. That's his long phenomenological way of saying, hey, law doesn't make you holy. Law provides the situations by which you can become holy. Law is not what makes you eligible for heaven. Law prepares the conditions by which you can get to heaven. It creates a basin. It creates an order in the society by which, hey, this is organized such that you can get to heaven. So, for example, does following the law get you to heaven? And the answer is, which law are you talking about? Let's say confession. Confession, we believe, washes away sin, becomes a means of sacramental grace and all the things that we believe about confession. Okay, what makes the confession valid? Can I just have an intention? Do I have to actually go? What about over the phone? Can I do it over Zoom and things like, can I go to confession over Zoom? This is a pretty serious question. What's the conditions by which sacramental graces then can be applied, by which the sacrament of confession happened? That's where law comes in. And we say, by the way, you can't do it over Zoom, just if you're interested. So that we can say, hey, this is how we need to regulate it. This is how we need to be. This becomes across the board, not only for sacramental realities, but organizations within the church for structuring ourselves. How are we going to structure? There are certain things then that create that basin. One more final point about just the nature of law itself. The nature of law itself is putting into practice what we believe. Not just creating the conditions, but it's actually putting into practice what we believe. So, for example, if we believe the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, how then does a society that regulates itself, how does a society regulates itself if we truly believe that? If we believe marriage is a sacrament and by nature is exclusive, is open to children, is permanent and lifelong, if we believe all these things about marriage, how does a church organize itself? How do we act? Are there things that we're going to do, that we're going to regulate, that's going to make that more clear or less clear? Are there things, and how should we do things to actually bring that out? Well, the Council of Trent came along and said, we believe in this so much that we're going to require when a couple gets married, they need to go to an official designee of the church, a priest or deacon or otherwise, and have to say certain things to bring out that belief. And so when you get to a marriage, for example, the priest or the deacon, the officiant, starts to ask in the rite of marriage, hey, we need to ask them, did you come here freely of your own accord? Why? Because we believe marriage cannot be forced. Will you accept children lovingly for the Lord? Why? Because we believe the nature of marriage is open to procreation and education of children. So down the line, these things that we regulate and we act in, canon law puts into practice what we believe. So we can say that canon law is where the rubber hits the road. Because we believe this, we must act like this. Because we believe A, we have to act like B. Because we are so committed to creating a conditions by which grace can flourish like this, then we have to regulate ourselves like this. There's a logical connection that happens. Great damage in the church happens when we act in a way that we don't believe, that we do things in a manner by which it confuses what we believe in doctrine and practice, whatever it may be. That's the definition of scandal. Scandal, when you look in the catechism, when you look in moral theology, you look in canon law, doesn't just mean that people are surprised or shocked. Sometimes nobody's surprised or shocked. Scandal is when we believe this, but we acted in a different way. That's what scandal is. And so when something is scandalous, when we have, for example, a priest or a bishop who's stealing from the collection or something like that, that's a scandal because it's not supposed to be like that. We don't believe in that. When we have, for example, tribunals who are looking at marriage cases and treating it like Catholic divorce, that becomes scandalous because that's not what we believe. We don't believe in divorce. We don't believe in this and that. So how do we act if we believe that marriage is this, this, and this? Okay. That's the nature of canon law. A couple of final aspects then. There's some challenges that comes to canon law. There's some misunderstandings that people have with canon law. One of the main misunderstandings that people have is equating it with civil law. In other words, we've all seen shows on TV, attorney show, lawyer shows and stuff like that on TV. We all see kind of the courtroom and things like that. Sometimes people take that and they just translates it over to canon law, and that doesn't quite work. There are some things that overlap. There are a lot of things that do not overlap. Now, I'm both a canon lawyer and an attorney, so I have one foot in both worlds, and I see this tension all the time. And part of my work is to try to get people to understand each other. Civil law of the society is a little bit different than how the church puts together her canon law. By the way, the church's canon law, the Catholic canon law, is the longest continuously functioning legal system in the Western world. More than Jewish law. Jewish law has serious gaps in it. Our civil law, for example, here in the United States, 400 years at best. Even if we based it on the law of England, the common law of England, that's only a few hundred years more. By the way, the law of England was highly, highly influenced by canon law. If you look at the origins of English common law, which then became law in the United States, a lot of the principles, it actually flowed from canon law. I always tell my civil lawyers, friends, that you guys don't even realize how much you rely on canon law almost every single day. For example, the concept of innocent before proven guilty was not always something society had. We see this in ancient law, Roman law, and laws of the ancient world, Greek law and things like that. There were certain things where if you were suspected of a crime, you were presumed to be guilty first and you had to prove your innocence. If you were a slave, you had no rights. If you were a woman, you had no rights. If you were a foreigner, you had no rights. And if a foreigner or a slave or a shepherd committed a crime, they were presumed to be guilty first. Also, those four groups, shepherds, women, foreigners, and slaves, they were not permitted to give testimony because they were presumed to be unreliable. The church came along and said, no, that's not right. That's not just. Which, by the way, it puts a real interesting perspective on who it is that first came to the incarnation. In other words, at Christmas, when Jesus was born, who was it that came to be his witnesses? Foreigners, shepherds were there. Guys who were, magicians, three magi. These are not the people who were reliable in court, in other words. Yet God chose them to be the witnesses to the incarnation. women were not permitted to give testimony unless their husbands allowed them to do so, which makes it absolutely amazing that the first witness to the resurrection in the gospel is a woman, Mary Magdalene, that was told to go and tell my apostles, go and tell my followers about the resurrection, that I've ascended to my heaven. The most important message in the entire gospel, that of the resurrection, was given to somebody whose society deemed unreliable to give the first testimony or any testimony. That's how God works. So, in the ancient world, that type of testimony, the church came along and said, nope, innocent until proven guilty. Witnesses are worthy unless they're proven not to be. Those are principles that carried on through English common law and got translated over to the churches, into our societal American law as well. Another one, just as a quick example, the things that we teach about marriage also flows a lot from English common law. So you read state statutes. Now, of course, American law has shifted quite a bit on marriage and divorce and things like that, and it's constantly shifting, but the basic core of it came from common law. So influential was canon law in English society, even after the English Reformation happened. You can see it in, for example, Shakespeare. For example, his famous sonnet 116, "Let me not the marriage of true minds admit any impediments." Why would somebody, a poet, when talking about love and marriage, talk about impediments? There's only one place where you talk about impediments in marriage. That's in canon law. When you're looking at the canon law of marriage, you talk about what impedes marriage. And he's using this beautiful analogy of the marriage of minds. I don't want to put any impediments in it. Shakespeare had a canonical backdrop in his mind that was formed by his society. One of the assignments that I got when I was studying marriage law at Catholic University was our professor said, I tell you what, for your midterm paper, I want you to pick one Shakespearean play, a comedy, and write about the marriage aspects in it, the canonical marriage aspects in it. And I thought this was a silly assignment. I'm like, what do you mean this is a waste of time? We're in law school here, we're trying to study law, and why are you having us read Shakespeare? And so I picked Taming the Shrew. I'm like, okay, it's gonna be a short paper. What did I find? Marriage law all over the place. And he was so confident in that he said, pick any Shakespearean comedy, because they all deal with marriage in some way. And they all have canonical elements of marriage in it, every single one. That's how much law had informed the thinking of Shakespeare and of society. So when people equate canon law with civil law, that's a big temptation, and it doesn't quite translate because the church's law has a different nature, a different reason. A couple of differences in civil law and canon law, for example. One of the major differences is that in American civil law, we have the buck stopping at a different place. The buck stops in American law at pretty much the courts, because we have, as you know from your government classes, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. That's how the founding fathers set it up based on ancient Roman law. The legislative branch creates the law. The executive branch puts it into practice. What does the judicial branch do? And so in the Federalist Papers, you have, Jefferson, Jay, and Adams, those guys kind of figuring out, okay, where does the buck stop? And they said the most logical place for us would be to put it in the judicial branch so that they can interpret the law. That's where we get courts and things like that. They knew, though, that there's a limit to that. And I think sometimes we see the limit to that. The judicial branch pretty much gets the final say of interpreting law. Okay, so we're used to that in American society. In canon law, it all culminates in the legislator. The one who legislates, the one who is able to put the law into effect, is also the one who can execute it and is the final authority to interpret it. Now, for us as Americans, that's like, hey, that's a little uncomfortable. It seems like a combination of power that's kind of weird for law. And we say, yeah, if you're thinking in a legal society, but think of a family. How does that work in a family? Yeah, the parents are the ones that come out with the law, they execute the law, and they interpret the law as well. It works in a family, it works beautifully in a family. In my family, I don't come up with the law, make my wife execute the law, and then have my oldest child be the judge on whether or not that was just. That doesn't work in a family. So the church says, yeah, in your legal system, that's fine. In our legal system, we see it more as a family law. And so that's why people are like, well, how can the bishop come out with the law and judge what the law means? Yeah, he's the legislator. He's the father figure in the society. So the functioning of it seems a little bit off to us if we apply a civil law mentality to it. One more major difference. Civil law is for regulating the society so that we can function in the society. In other words, to put it in more layman's term, it's so that I don't beat you up and you don't beat me up. It's to regulate how we treat each other. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos, anarchy that's going on. The church says, yeah, our law is also for that. We want people to treat each other correctly, but it's for salvation. It's for a purpose. There's a teleology in the fancy philosophical, theological word. That means a purpose for it. What's the purpose? For heaven. The law is for salvation. The law is to not only regulate us as a society, it's to help us get to heaven and increase holiness, like John Paul was saying. That's why there is an ancient, what they call a regula juris. A regula juris are these little sayings that are done so that when we're applying the law, we can keep the saying in mind so that we keep the context in mind. And we do this every now and then too. We throw out like a principle every now and then. So the principle that comes down to us is salus animarum suprema lex. The salvation of souls is the supreme law. The salvation of souls is the supreme law. What that means is when we're doing law, we keep that in mind. We keep that before our eyes. What's the purpose of implementing this law? What is the purpose of regulating ourselves like this? For the salvation of souls, because that's the supreme law. Christmas 1982. Christmas 1982, John Paul II is the Pope. Ratzinger is his doctrine guy, head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He has several expert canon lawyers on his tribunals and things like that. Christmas 1982 came, and they finally give him the final draft of the Code of Canon Law, the 83 Code of Canon Law. Now, why is that a big deal? Because on January 25th, they were going to hit an anniversary date. What's significant about the date January 25th? Way back in 1959, Pope John the 23rd, on January 25th, came out with 3 announcements. Announcement number 1, we're going to have a synod for the Diocese of Rome. Oh, people started going crazy. We haven't had a synod here in years. How do we even do a synod? That means that he's going to be regulating and things like that in the Diocese of Rome. People went crazy. Second announcement, same day, same announcement. He said, oh, by the way, number 2, we're going to revise the Code of Canon Law. Oh my goodness, the first code was in 1917, the first time it was put together. And now just a few decades later, we're going to reform it. Oh, news was going crazy. Third announcement, oh, by the way, we're going to have the 21st Ecumenical Council, Vatican II. Things went berserk. People were like, ah. So all of a sudden, that third announcement of an ecumenical council eclipsed the 2. They didn't realize that the 3 actually were kind of tied together. And so what they did was, okay, the synod in Rome, we're going to do that as a practice pretty much to how we're going to run the council. And they said the revision of the Code of Canon Law, let's put that on pause, because what we need to do is we need to have the council first. Because the council is going to talk about the nature of the church in the modern world, the nature of the liturgy, the nature of revelation, all these things that we were going to talk about in church life. Let's wait until after the Second Vatican Council before we revise the code. And so Vatican II happened from 1962 to 1965. And after that, the code revision started in the late 60s and all through the 70s. It took a while. That's why, if you think back to the period of the late 60s and into the 70s, there was actually a lot of confusion about canon law at that time because it was being revised. A lot of things went out of regulation. Other things were coming in separate documents. We didn't have the internet and all that. So it became kind of a confusing time on how to function. And so John Paul was like, hey, we got to get this done. We got to get this done. So they had commissions. They had, of course, listening sessions, working groups, and all that stuff, all through the 10 years of the 70s into the 80s. And John Paul, finally, when he became Pope, said, hey, we got to get this done. This has been going on for a decade plus. The church really needs to be regulated because things are getting difficult. People are having all kinds of misunderstandings and doing crazy things. We have to get this regulated. So they worked and worked. Christmas of 1982, they gave it to John Paul to do the final review. John Paul's thinking, okay, what we do is we promulgate usually on the anniversary. January 25th is the date that I want to promulgate it. And so he and Ratzinger, I'm imagining this conversation, looked at each other and said, well, wait a minute, that gives us about a month, less than a month, to go through the entire 1,700, almost 2,000 canons that are in there. How are we going to do that? He said, let's say Christmas Mass, and then let's shut ourselves in and do it. And so Christmas 1982, after Christmas Mass and all the Urbi et Orbit, all the stuff that you usually do, John Paul pretty much kind of cleared his schedule as much as he could. He took Ratzinger and 2 or 3 other advisors in, and they went through every single draft of every single canon and thought it through. And if you look at the code revision from the final draft to what was finally promulgated, there's all kinds of interesting additions and movements that they made right at the end there. So on January 25th, 1983, about a month later, he comes out with the promulgation and promulgates the 83 Code of Canon Law. Why do I bring that up? Because one of those revisions that was put in by the hand of John Paul II himself was he insisted the last canon must have that regula juris. In other words, the last canon must talk about the salvation of souls as the supreme law. It focuses in on it. So that's why if you read the Code of Canon Law, it's actually kind of odd, that last canon, because guess what the last canon is talking about? The transfer of pastors. The transfer of pastors is just it's one of those things where it's like, hey, the transfer of pastors, that's just the final thing that we're talking about here. And then all of a sudden, so reading the last canon, Canon 1752, in cases of transfers of pastors, the prescripts of Canon 1747 are to be applied. Okay, that's just procedural. Canonical equity is to be observed. So when you're transferring pastors, you have to make sure that you're following all the laws and you do it fairly. And the salvation of souls, which must always be the supreme law in the church, is to be kept before the eyes. It's like a big exclamation point at the end all of a sudden. That's no mistake. That even in something like transferring pastors, we have to keep in mind the salvation of souls. Even in the things that are kind of mundane in the church, or we might think is mundane, is for the salvation of souls. And so when my seminarians are sitting there and we're going through the Code of Canon Law, and we're studying canon law and things like that, and they say, well, how much of this do I have to implement? What's the limit? Can I do this? And I would say, well, the salvation of souls is there as a regula juris for you, as a focus for you. It's never there as an excuse to break the law. When you follow the law, as difficult as it may be sometimes, what you're doing is you're bolstering the society of the church so that the salvation of souls can happen. Even when it's difficult, even when it's a situation where we have to stand firm, the laws of the church, the teachings of the church becomes one of those things that is that gives people the direction. One final story, and then we'll break it up into some questions here. There was I heard this from a friend of mine, so I wasn't involved in the case. But there was a gentleman who went to his pastor, and later on this pastor became a bishop. But he went to his pastor, and he said, I'm struggling with same-sex attraction, and I don't believe in the church's teachings on it. And so the pastor, well, let's talk. And so they would talk, and so he lays out and he explains to them. So they had several conversations, and it got to the point where the young man was like, I absolutely can't accept that at all. And so he started going into a tirade on this priest and just belittling him and the church and cussing him out and pretty much saying, I'm out of here if you guys are going to treat me like this. And the pastor said, look, the most compassion that he can muster up, he said, no, this is, I wish I can tell you otherwise. But this, because, and then he explained it and everything. The guy said, I'm out of here. See ya. And so he leaves. Not the end of the story, though. Several years later, the guy had a change of heart. Several years later, he left the lifestyle, came back to the church, became a very active, committed Catholic. And he came back to the pastor, and he told him, hey, years ago, when you stood firm, when you explained things to me, I was doing everything I can, and I hated you for it. I hated the church for it. And he said, but thank you for never taking away the roadmap that allowed me to come back. Without that roadmap, I would have never been able to come back. I hated the roadmap. I hated that truth. I hated you. But I never lost the roadmap. You gave me the roadmap to be able to come back. That's how we view law in the church. This is the roadmaps. These are the roadmaps that put into practice what we believe. Don't take away the roadmap from people, even when it's difficult. All right, with that, a little bit of an introduction there. Let's open it up for Q&A. What does canon law address? What does it deal with? And I always tell people, everything, the whole life of the church. The canons kind of regulate and things like that because we're creating a society of the church. I had one person who said, how can you Catholics actually believe? That's so many laws. We just need the simplicity of the gospel. Oh, 1,752 canons? You expect me to know all that in order? How can I function like that? And I told him, hey, have you seen the Wisconsin state tax code? It's like tons, 30, 40 volumes or something like that. You function just fine. Not only that, then there's the federal laws and all this. We function in a society just fine. Am I expected to know all that? It's like, yeah, we're expected to know all that. Not to be experts in it, but we're expected to be able to function within that. 1,752 canons for 1 billion Catholics. I think that's pretty impressive. That's pretty simplified under one. Okay, let's open it up. Anybody?
Just a comment. So there's coffee here. I brewed a lot of coffee. So yeah, feel free to take some of that. And then also, I had one other note. Oh yeah, come up to the microphone if you have a question so that it can be on the recording. I have a...
Or we can repeat it too. So
yeah, okay. I have an anonymous question. Can I be in union with the church if I think that Vatican II failed in its pastoral mission?
A good question. The first thing to look at is what do we mean by union with the church? And this is where the code actually helps us quite a bit. In theology, first of all, but then also into the canonical discipline, we have what we see as what do we mean by union, communion with the church. So union, yes, but in Latin, when you put the cum, meaning with, before something, it emphasizes it a little bit. It makes it more perfect, more strong. So union is union. Communion is with union, that there's a shared relationship that's going on. So that's why we speak of not just union, but communion with the church. The Second Vatican Council, interestingly enough, was the one that lays out a deeper understanding of this. Vatican II, in its dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, speaks about the relationship that we have with the body of Christ. So there is this thing, the body of Christ, and we have certain connections with it. There are some that have less of that, some that have more of that. And so we start to speak about full communion with the church, recognizing that there are attachments that can be had with the church that are less than perfect. So Canon 206, fleshing that out. As a matter of fact, you look at Canon 206, it references, if you have a version that references the Second Vatican Council as its source, it has Lumen Gentium all over in the footnotes there, because it's referencing that. And Canon 205 says this: those baptized are fully in communion with the church, fully in communion with the Catholic Church on this earth, if who are joined with Christ. In other words, full communion, you got to be baptized. And then you got to have these next 4 things to be in full communion with the church. 1, union with Christ in its visible structure. In other words, those who believe, hey, those who are baptized, but I don't want to be in union with the visible structure that God left on earth. Now, that structure can change because that's part of what do we call positive law. In other words, yeah, there is a structure in the church, but God allows the church the authority to structure that. For example, we don't have to structure ourselves as dioceses and parishes. That's something that the church way back picked up from Roman law. Our organization of parish to diocese to province, archdioceses, to regions and all that, that's ancient Roman law. That's how Caesar did it. That's how Pontius Pilate organized things. And so the church came along, because it was very Roman also, and said, hey, that's not a bad idea. And so we're going to organize that, our churches like that. So even to this day, when we talk about parishes and things like that, that's an ancient Roman law thing. Can that change? Absolutely. Yeah, that's a man-made thing that we can change and still have a structure of the church. Do we have to have the bishops' conference, which is kind of advisory? Do we have to have dean's council? These things. We don't have to have those to still be the church, but the church has done that so that we can bring out the reality a little bit more. So the first one is to be baptized. The second thing is to be joined with the visible structure of the church. If I say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with the visible structure of the church, I'm not in full communion. Structure by the bonds of the profession of faith. I have to believe in the profession of faith. That's why when somebody joins the church, particularly as an adult, we ask the declaration, the profession of faith. Not only do you reject Satan and all this stuff, do you believe in God the Father? Do you believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son? Well, we go through these things, and at the end we say, this is our faith. We are proud to profess it. That's because we're being joined in the profession of faith. So far, baptized, joined to the visible structure, joined to the profession of faith, joined via the sacraments as well. Participation in the sacraments become the visible structure, becomes the visible bond that's there. And the fourth thing, ecclesiastical governance. In other words, I am under the ecclesiastical governance. I put myself under the ecclesiastical governance. Notice what it does not say. It doesn't say join to the ecclesiastical governance only when they're being good, only when they're making good decisions. Now, do I have to believe and have to do an immoral decision? No, I don't have to. But do I have to follow decisions that I don't agree with if it's squarely within the legitimate authority's power to do so? Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. Let's say the bishop of a diocese wants to close my parish. That would be something that I would have a big problem with. That's going to have some serious pastoral damages and things like that. Does he have the right to make that decision if he goes through all the correct procedural canonical steps, which the church lays there and says, Bishop, you got it. If you're going to do that, you got to do this and this and this because we want the visible society to be served. We want the salvation of souls. And so if the bishop goes through and does all of that, he has the right to make that decision. And as difficult as that is on me, I can't say, well, I'm not going to follow that. I need to, because I need to be joined in ecclesiastical governance. Now, if the bishop goes out and tells me, hey, you may not pray the rosary. You may not go to Mass. Like, Bishop, that's an immoral decision. You don't have that jurisdiction to tell me not to go to Mass. Okay, so I don't have to follow that because he's acting outside of his ecclesial governance at that point. Okay, so back to the question then, can you be joined to the church? Can you have union with the church if you disagree in the pastoral success of the Second Vatican Council? I would have to parse that just a little bit more. Are you saying that the Second Vatican Council is not a valid ecumenical council? If you're saying, no, I reject the 21st ecumenical council of the church, you are not in union with the church. You're not in communion with the church because you've rejected that ecclesiastical governance that says, I reject the 21st council. By the way, we do have groups who reject councils. The Eastern Orthodox are not in union with us because they only recognize the first 7 councils. After Second Constantinople, Second Council of Constantinople in 787, they said, no, we don't recognize any of the councils after that. We don't recognize Lateran councils. We don't recognize Trent. We don't recognize Vatican I. We don't recognize Vatican II. They're not in full communion with the church then. So if somebody comes along and says, I reject the 21st council of the church, it's like that means that you're not in communion. You've put yourself in a status similar to the Eastern Orthodox because you rejected a council. Now, that being said, if somebody says, hey, I don't think the effects of the council has been very successful, that's not a rejection of the council. I can say, hey, I reject that the Council of Trent was that effective. That doesn't make me a bad Catholic. That may make me a historically incorrect Catholic, but it doesn't make me, I didn't reject the Council of Trent at that point. So if the question is such that somebody is saying, hey, yeah, the council happened as a valid council, but afterwards we did some real strange things that didn't really work, that didn't really implement it correctly, I think that's fine. So long as it's done with something else, because the code actually is very balanced. If you go to the famous Canon 212, there's several sections. And the section speaks about obedience in the church, but the canon also talks about how you speak out about certain things and certain needs. So, for example, Canon 212 in section 2 says, the Christian faithful are free to make known to the pastors of the church their needs especially spiritual ones and their desires. By pastor here, the Latin word pastoris, meaning those who have pastoral care. So it includes obviously the pastor, the assistant pastors, it includes the deacons, it includes the bishops, it includes the conference, it includes Rome, it includes the Pope, those who have pastoral care. Canon 212 is saying, hey, the Christian faithful, you're free to make known to those who have pastoral care over you your needs, especially your spiritual needs. That's not only that's a right in the church that you have. The bishop can't say, "Get out of here, shut up. You can't bring that out. Don't tell me what you need. I know what you need." Bishop has to say, "Hey, no, they have the right to make this need known." So then it goes further, though. That's kind of not very controversial. Section 2 of Canon 212, according to the knowledge, competence, and prestige that they possess, meaning positions that they possess, they have the right and even at times the duty to manifest which pertains to the good of the church. Which I think it starts to get very shocking because, okay, not only do I now have the right to present my needs, the coach just told me sometimes I have the duty to bring that forward. I have the duty to talk to my pastor and those pastors of the church to tell them the needs that's going on. So not just the right, but the duty at times. And it goes on, to make their opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful. When I read that's the first time I about fell out of my chair. Because I always thought that you had to kind of, be muted about things. They're saying, no, you have the right to bring forward your needs. Sometimes you have the duty to speak up. And sometimes you have the duty not only to bring your opinions out, but to manifest that opinions to others. By the way, this is a new canon based on Vatican II. So when somebody's rejecting, saying, oh, Vatican II, I reject, that means that you just rejected your ability also in law to manifest your opinion, because the 17 Code did not say this. Okay, so ironically, but then it goes on, here's the balance. Without prejudice, in other words, holding to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors, and attentive to the common advantage and dignity of persons. A mouthful, but it's saying, hey, but when you speak out, here's what you got to remember. One, the integrity of faith and morals. Is your speaking out hurting faith and morals? Is your speaking out confusing people on faith and morals? Is your speaking out being scandalous, misrepresenting what the church says, what the church teaches? So let's go back to the suppression of a parish example. Let's say the bishop suppresses my parish. Do I have the right to bring out the needs? And the answer is absolutely, I have the right to do that. And sometimes the duty to that. I think those on parish councils have a duty. The pastor has it. So if they see this as, hey, there's a problem here, bishop, they have a duty to speak out. Can they even talk to other people about it? And the answer is yes. But as we're speaking out, as we're talking to other people, how are we doing it? The integrity of faith and morals is the first one. I can't go out and say, well, bishop is closing this parish. I have the right to speak out, and I'm saying that he's an idiot. He can't do this to us. And that's not speaking out anymore. That's striking against faith and morals. That's becoming scandalous. That's whipping people up. That's not just making your needs manifest and known. The code goes on, respecting faith and morals with reverence towards the pastors. Is this a respectful dialogue that's going on? In the age of social media, in the age of the internet, that gets more challenging. This October, I've been asked to give a presentation to the Canonical Society of America on this very topic, the canonical and civil implications of social media in the church, specifically the use of social media by clerics and by bishops in the church. What are the issues that have to be weighed? And this is one of the canons that I'm going to go to examine this. On social media, that's speaking out, sure. On social media, is that First Amendment? Okay, sure. But is it Canon 212, Section 3 as well? Is it speaking out with the good of the church in mind? With the integrity of faith and morals, and now with reverence towards the pastors? Is there a reverence? Is there a respectful dialogue going on? But then it doesn't stop there. It says, attentive also to the common advantage and dignity of persons. So I would say go on your favorite Catholic blog, Twitter account, whatever, and see if the person speaking out is checking all these boxes. Before you press send of your opinion, check through Canon 212, Section 3 to see if it's checked all the boxes here. And if not, then we may be stepping out just a little bit. So a long answer to a short question. Can you be in communion with the church and reject the pastoral nature of the Second Vatican Council if, one, you accept that the council is truly a valid council of the church, the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Church? I think it's okay to look at and say, hey, Vatican II has not been successful in this way, this way, and this way. In some ways, it's been very successful. For example, the person being able to criticize and to bring that out means that Vatican II was a little successful in being able to put Canon 212 there. And then, when they're speaking out about this, this, and this, are they being attentive to the dignity of persons, the advantage of persons, integrity of faith and morals, reverence to the pastor, and to the integrity of the faith? The code guides it like that. If people live according to that and live according to that, notice how it regulates the society of the church to be able to have those questions, those dialogues. Great question.
I have two questions. The first one's more so biblical versus canonical, so maybe you know it. Maybe
Sure,
not.
why not?
So in the story of David, he commits adultery with Bathsheba, and then he invites Uriah off the battlefield to try to get him to sleep with his wife. And then he sends Uriah back with a letter to Joab to have him killed on the battlefield. Do you know anything about Joab's family lineage back to the time of Goliath? I was in a conversation about that the other day, and we couldn't figure it out.
The short answer is no. No, Joab's lineage, we can look that up, but off the top of my head, no. I don't know the lineage of Joab.
Great. Okay.
Easy question.
Second question. I was home over Easter break, and a seminarian friend and I were going to Mass, and they were setting up a polling place right outside the sanctuary of the church, and it was kind of oh, that just feels kind of weird.
In the church?
Yeah. Can you kind of speak into where the church kind of draws the line as far as bringing politics into the church building and actually setting up a polling place in the building itself?
Wow, so. Good question. Very interesting question. We have designated in the church things called sacred spaces. So what's a sacred space? A sacred space is a place that is set aside, set apart, consecrated for a specific purpose. What's the purpose of our sacred spaces? This is where the Paschal mystery is manifested. This is where the sacrifice of Calvary, heaven opens up, and heaven comes to our dimension. That's why in a lot of old churches, you see on the in the front somewhere in a cornerstone, maybe over the door, they'll say Domus Dei et Porta Caeli. It comes from the Old Testament as well. The house of God and the gate of heaven. Because the understanding is when you go in here, this is where God dwells, and this is also where the gate opens up and heaven enters into this space. So the sacred space is not just where we do things. Sacred space is an important thing where it's set apart. And it'd be great if the new church somewhere had a Domus Dei at Porta Caeli on it, just to remind ourselves of that. Given that, and the reason I say that is that then what we allow to happen in and around our churches become very important, because that's the sacred space. That's where heaven is entering in. Is this keeping with the dignity of that place, the purpose of that place? So if somebody is, and I presume when you say sanctuary, what you actually mean is the church proper, behind the pews and all that stuff, and not just the sanctuary like the altar area, right? Right. So in other words, they're out in the narthex or the vestibule or something like that as a polling place. The question I would have is twofold. The first question would be, obviously that has to be allowed by an authority because you're technically outside the sacred space itself. But you're in the narthex, it's in a connected place with there. So the first place is that allowed by the authority of the church? Because the code is not going to clearly say one way or the other. It talks about the church proper within there, but it doesn't talk about outside the door there of the church. So that being said, that's going to be deferred to the authority in the church, of course, the pastor going all the way up to the bishop. Second question, though, is, okay, aside from can we make that decision, the question has to be, what is that conveying? The fact that you were scandalized means that, to me, there's some sort of things that were not being weighed. If people are misunderstanding, hey, there's something not right with that, I would say maybe we don't want to do that. What about over in the church, gym or something like that? Maybe. Maybe what about in the church hall? Maybe that's a little bit better. But given the political climate and things like that, should we be doing that? To put it right outside of the church doors there, it becomes less and less defensible, in other words, at that point. So I think that's how canonically we would go about thinking it through.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
I have a question that kind of is both biblical and ecclesiastical law. I wonder, I'm very confused about the status of veils in the church, specifically because in the Bible there's a pretty explicit command for women to veil, but then in the Code of Canon Law there was a command and then there wasn't. How does that work? Like the law that's in the Bible versus the law that would be in canon law?
Yeah, great question. Lots of balls in the air with this one. Let's start with the how we approach it, first of all. The way that we approach it is this. Be very, very careful when we're approaching something and we see canonical legislation and then we see something in Scripture. The question is, who discerns that? If we discern and to say, hey, if I see something in Scripture and I see something in canon law that doesn't jive, I'm the one that can decide what's binding or not. What we've done is we've become a Protestant. Because what we've done is if we look at Scripture, who has the authority? The authority has always been in the official structure. All the way back to the Old Testament, going through the time of Christ, the Acts of the Apostles, there's an official authority that regulates. There's an official authority that is able to say, hey, this is right, this is not. Okay, so in St. Paul, in I believe it was Corinthians, where he talks about the veiling, he uses pretty strong language. And the language seems to be based on natural law even. Which means that, okay, if that is the explanation for the reason of that, is that something that is bound? If it is bound, that means that it needs to show up in our church regulation. So we have, for example, natural law provisions in the Old Testament. I'll give you an example. Third commandment, keep holy the Lord's day. That's a natural law based on the nature, what we call the nature of religion, that God owes praise and adoration, things like that. Yeah, how do we do that? That's where the church comes in and says, you got to go to church every single Sunday. That's an obligation. Can the church change that obligation? And the answer is yes, it can. It cannot change that you have to keep holy the Lord's day. How that's done, the church has discerned. Right now, the law is that you go to Mass on every Sunday. Has that developed? And the answer is yes, because think about it. The church now also believes satisfying that obligation with the Vigil Mass. That's a later development. That's not in the New Testament, that you can satisfy your third commandment obligation to attend Mass the night before. That's the church's allowance that's going on. Can the church restrict that and say we will no longer allow Vigil Mass? Yeah, the church can do that. Can the church say, keep holy the Lord's day. You can either go to Mass or you have to pray the Liturgy of the Hours in community. Yeah, the church can say that as well. So somebody can't say, well, wait a minute. Here I see keep holy the Lord's day. The church cannot not bind people to go to Mass every Sunday. Yes, the church can make that decision. With the veil thing then, that's how I see it. I think in St. Paul, there's some pretty strong language about the nature of veiling that's going on. How that translates into a canonical legislation is a different matter. Under the 17 Code of Canon Law, it was a requirement for women to veil themselves for liturgical celebrations such as Mass. The 83 Code of Canon Law came along, and in Canon 6, very, very clearly does what we call an abrogation. When this when this code takes force, meaning November 27, 1983 was when it took force. When this code took force, the following are abrogated. The Code of Canon Law promulgated in 1917. So this Code of Canon Law clearly says, hey, when this goes into force, that entire code is abrogated. You're not bound by that code, except where it repeats things, except where it brings back things. So this code governs now. It abrogates the whole thing. So when somebody says, but the Canon Law of 1917 said women must do that, but yeah, this has abrogated that. So the question is, where does that show up in the 83 Code? And it simply doesn't show up in the 83 Code. So now what that means is St. Paul's exhortation for women to veil is an exhortation to veil, but the church does not at this point in history require women to be veiled. Women then have to make that decision in conscience. If somebody says, well, reading the scriptures then, I feel like I do have an obligation to veil. That's right. That's perfectly fine if you feel in conscience to do that. So long as you weigh the reasons why, you can certainly put that obligation on yourself to do that. But you can't say, hey, but she has to have that obligation as well. One final thing to step back. When we look at things in these types of questions canonically, it's easy to get bogged down. It's easy to see that notion of, do I have to do it or not? The bigger question is, why is that going on? St. Paul, when he talks about the reason and things like that, he's actually a little more vague about the reason. He makes kind of a natural law argument about the angels and things like that. What is going on and why in the liturgical celebration that's going on? My explanation for it is this. My explanation is, look, when a woman veils, what is the purpose of that? Well, is it a modesty thing? Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, there's modesty going on there as well. But when a woman veils, the reason that I see, when I see a woman veiling, she becomes an icon, a reflection. An icon is not just a picture. An icon is something that we look through. It's a window towards eternity. So the icons in the Eastern churches, that's why they put it in front of the altars and the iconostasis and things like that, because they become windows that you can look into the divine. When I see a woman veil at Mass, she is a window into the divine. What's the window into the divine that I see when a woman wears her veil? Is because she is mirroring a bride going to the bridegroom. Only women can really do that in an iconography. When a woman wears her veil, it reminds me of my anima, feminine. Anima, the word soul is feminine in grammar, in Latin. The anima, who's the bridegroom? Jesus Christ. When I see a woman veil, I'm reminded of the nature of the church. I'm reminded of my own nature as the church being the bride of Christ, going into union with her bridegroom, Jesus Christ. So the veil at church, seeing that veil, I'm like, oh yeah, this is the feminine nature of the church that's being brought out in a very beautiful way, mimicking or kind of reminiscence. That's why brides wear veils also. It mimics and echoes that, if you will, and becomes an iconography of that. Is that required? Absolutely not. The other interesting thing to remember also is that if you look in the code of the 17 Code of Canon Law, there's a segregation of the sexes as well. We don't do that. In other words, men need to sit over here and women need to be separated over there. That was the custom that was going on. If you go to some Vietnamese masses, you'll still see some traditional communities do that, where women would sit on one side with the children, the men would sit on the other side. We're not pressing that. We're not saying that carries over as well, because that's been abrogated as well. So long answer to a short question.
Hi, so I have a question on Traditionis Custodes.
Yes. Non-controversial topics.
Yeah. So I was introduced to Latin Mass here about 5 years ago and fell in love with it. And to me, this is a very tyrannical motu proprio because it took my father away from me. It broke my family up. And I recently read a book by a French priest, does Traditionis Custodes pass the juridical rationality test. I thought he made a pretty compelling case that it really didn't match a condition that actually exists within the church, and that it's kind of a new sort of just out of the blue legislative law. So my question is there a historical precedence of a pope doing something like this that didn't really match a reality within the church that eventually just kind of disappeared or was overturned by a later pope? So is there any sort of historical situation like that?
Oh, great question. Yeah, great question. A tough question that's going on. When Traditionis came out, and the accompanying documents that came out afterwards, the responses ad dubium, those types of things that came out. What we canonists do is we run to the end of the document first, because the end of the document actually gives you all kinds of information that's going on. How was it promulgated? Was it promulgated correctly? The procedural things that we want to know as well. There's a lot going on right now with that issue. The way I would approach it is this. First thing is getting down, can an authority make a bad decision? And the answer is, yeah, I think authorities, such as myself as a father, I make bad decisions for my families a lot, and some I regret later on and things like that. Some I think are pretty good decisions, but turns out not to be. The question, and the reason I bring that up is to parse, first of all, can that be done versus whether or not that was the best thing to be done. Sometimes the conversation confuses the two a little bit, at least when I'm reading on the internet and things like that. Sometimes people disagree with the decision, and it floats into because you can't make that decision at all. And it's not always the case. Now, to lay my cards on the table, I think this was a highly imprudent decision that was done. I think it was unnecessary, and I think it definitely could have been implemented a lot better. Leaving that aside, can that decision be done? Does a pope have the authority to do that? And the answer has to be, well, the supreme authority of the church does have the right to regulate the liturgy. The regulation of the liturgy is something that's squarely in the hands of the church, of the supreme authority of the church, which for us as Latin Catholics means the authority of the Pope is such that he can make those types of decisions. Within that, then, settling that question, can he? Within that, when he makes the decision, what does he need to do? What does that supreme authority need to do? First of all, he has to tend to the salvation of souls. Canon 1752, is this for the salvation of the souls? He has to also tend to the nature, in this situation, of the historical reality of the liturgy. How is the things going on? So, can the Pope suppress rights? And we have to answer yes. Why? Because look what the Council of Trent did. When the Council of Trent came along, it actually suppressed the rights that were less than 200 years old. It suppressed those rights. Same thing there. A lot of people were like, gosh, this is a terrible decision. I think 200 years, I think was a little arbitrary, the Council of Trent to do. Okay, surprisingly, I think the Council of Trent just dropped that needle there for some reason. I think it was, I understand why they were doing it, because there were a lot of rights popping up and things like that, even approved rights that were popping up. I think the difference, though, is that the Council of Trent was actually preserving the historicity of rights, because the rights that were less than 200 years were the ones that actually were popping up, I think, almost illegitimately, and without historical precedence and without growing from a liturgical continuity that was going on there. So if I were the fathers of the Council of Trent, I would say, hey, 200 years, I probably would have made it a little less than that, maybe 100 years or something like that. But they dropped that. They have the authority to do that. Traditionis, to its credit, said it did not suppress the right. The right was not suppressed. It limited the right quite a bit to making it necessary to go to Rome for permissions for it. It's what we call a reserved right. So if you recall, the first thing when it came out, the first thing that was not in there was anything about reservations of dispensation, because Canon 87 says that the bishop can dispense from universal law for a particular purpose, for the salvation of souls, for the spiritual good of the people. And so I was a chancellor at the time, and so I worked with my bishop, and the first thing we did was we had him issue a dispensation so that it could continue at one of the parishes that was there. No problem at that time. Somehow then, over in Rome, the clarification came out, no, you can't give the dispensation because now we withdraw that dispensation power to become what's called a reserved dispensation. And so now the permission has to be given from Rome in order to allow Latin Mass, in order to have it be able to continue in certain places. The question I have in my mind is, can the church do that? Can the supreme authority do that? And the answer in my mind has to be, yeah, the authority has the right to reserve dispensation, has the right to restrict. Is it a prudent decision? Is it one that is kind of passing our juridical thing in the sense of, is it respecting the salvation of souls? There are places where I have to question that. Under Canon 212, section 2 and 3, using what I understand of it, with all respect to the pastors of the church, all the way up to the supreme authority, not scandalizing anybody without any intention of scandalizing, I think that it's an imprudent decision, the way that it's being carried out, because I think it was unnecessary. But that's very different from can the authority do that? I think there's lots of inconsistencies also with it, and there's a ton of little type of things that I quibble with in there with some of it. It's very confused canonically. But the bottom line is, does the church have that authority? And the answer is yes. I think the church does have its authority. Yeah, great question. Well, John.
Ask for Bren. So the extraordinary form of, for example, absolving of sins. So you have the words of the absolution from the priest of the Novus Ordo absolve, and you have the pre-Novus Ordo one. With Traditionis Custodes, was that abrogated too? And second of all, like, what happens if you keep using the old one?
Yeah, I think the way that I read it, as much as I disagree with it, I think Traditionis did abrogate the permission for the celebration of the sacraments in the 62 rite. Carte blanche across the board. With that being said, there's a difference now that we have to parse between the laicity of things and the validity of things. At the end of the day, what makes the absolution valid? It is the word ego te absolvo, I absolve you. That's it. So the rite that is given to us wraps that validity element in all kinds of other things that are there, the traditional formulations, being done in Latin, stuff like that. It wraps it. The Novus Ordo rite wraps it in another set of language that's there. If those words are uttered with the proper persons, proper intention, things like that, the form of it is ego te absolvo, I absolve you. If you have that in whatever language, then it's a valid forgiveness of sins. It's a valid sacrament that's happening. Outside of that, then, the question is, well, then, what rite, R-I-T-E, do we have, and what rite can we use? What wrapping of it? Because we have this extraordinary form one, and then we have the current one, the revised one. Which one can I use? And if you notice, in both of those, it has that language in there, which means regardless of which one I use, it's a valid absolution that's going on. That being said, given Traditionis, I can't get around the fact, and I can't get around the language, that it seems like we cannot use the extraordinary form rite of it. If it's being used, I think that's an illicity that's going on, because the authority of the church, the supreme authority, has says we can't use it. Do sins get forgiven? Yeah, sins are getting forgiven, but the action, the liturgical action, is an illicit action while still being valid. I wish it were otherwise, but I can't see how that continues to be a licit celebration. I can't see where it's being allowed. There's no loopholes. There's nothing that I can find that allows that. Yeah. I wish it were otherwise. Good questions.
I have a question. What is the technical relation between the Novus Ordo and the Latin Rite?
Oh, you want to get to the microphone also? Sorry about that.
I have a question. What is the technical relation between the Novus Ordo and the Latin Rite? Are they different rites? Is the Novus Ordo technically a translation of the Latin Rite? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. It depends on how we define the word rite, R-I-T-E. Different people, when they're talking about rites, they mean certain things. And so I always ask people, what do you mean by rites? The way that is generally used when we talk about a rite, we mean a liturgical family. A liturgical family. So within the liturgies of the church, they're grouped in certain family trees, for example. They're all Catholic, but they're grouped in certain family trees. These family trees usually trace their roots all the way back, mostly to an apostolic origin of some sort. So we have, for example, the Latin Rite. The Latin Rite follows the liturgical family tree of what was done in the city of Rome, in the See of Peter, and then those developments that came from there. Within that family tree, there are a lot of branches that actually go out within that. And then we have, for example, in and around the Greek-speaking area, the eastern part of the Roman Empire at the time, the Byzantine family tree. They used the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom or the liturgy of St. James. those go back to patristic sources, and those develop in a family tree of rites. There's some rites that there's some forms that spring from that, but that's the Byzantine one. And then you go on, and there's the one in India, Syro-Malabar. There's these family trees that are going down all over the place. They're all Catholic. They're all not only Catholic, they're legitimate Catholic rites that have gone all the way back to patristic times. What we understand as the Latin rite, having its origin in Rome, springing from the time of St. Gregory the Great back in the 500s, and started to develop. Those family trees, sometimes people refer to the sprouts, the branches within those family trees, also as rites. That's where the confusion starts to come in. There's a mixture of terms. So when somebody says the Novus Ordo rite or the extraordinary form rite, what they mean is a branch within the rite that's going on. It's a Latin rite. So if we look at the Latin rites, there are several things that are in the Latin rite, because the Roman rite, the one in the city of Rome, what we now know as the traditional Latin Mass, isn't the only one that's there. In the family of the Latin rite, the Dominicans have a rite, valid, fully Catholic rite. In the area of Spain, we had a Mozarabic rite. In France, the area of France, we have a Gallican rite. Now, I'm using the word rite to mean branches within the Roman family, the Latin family that's there. And then we had, up in England, the Sarum rite that sprung forth from the Gregorian missionaries that went to Augustine of Canterbury and people like that who went to England. That was the Sarum rite that was going on there. So we had all these plurality. Mozarabic rite I'm sorry, not Mozarabic, the one in northern Italy that was there too. So all these rites that were going on, they're all Latin rites. They're all perfectly valid. Council of Trent came along and said, hey, these little branches that sprung out, if it's not 200 years or older, we're going to suppress those because we see those as later developments and illegitimate. So they suppress those. And so what we're left with is these rites. So the predominant rite in the West is the Roman rite, the one that came from the city of Rome. The Roman rite is the main branch, the trunk, if you will, in the Latin rite family. Okay, so you take that and you get to the Second Vatican Council. After the Second Vatican Council, there was a move to reform the Roman rite, what we know as the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass now, but it's really the Roman rite is probably the most precise way to look at it. The Roman rite had lots of sprouts, lots of branches. And so after the council, they wanted to reform the Roman rite. The idea, if you look at Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Constitution on the Liturgy, was to reform aspects of the Roman rite. All of a sudden, in 1965, they said, we'll do an interim reform of it. So they took the Roman rite and did a few tweaks. So certain parts were in the vernacular. There were a couple of things that were added and things like that. So from 65, for a few years, they said, we're going to do this ad experimentum, for an experiment. And those who were around in that time, you probably remember there was an interim mass, is what it became known as. Interim mass, meaning just the interim there. In 1970, there was years of this commission that was put together, and the commission put on Paul VI's desk, here's a Novus Ordo Missae, a new order of rite. And so Paul VI then promulgated it as, here's the Roman rite. So liturgical historians, canonists, liturgists, scratch our heads a little bit and say, okay, what is this? Is this a reformation of the Roman rite? Or is this a new sprout that has happened here, a new rite of Mass that has happened here? And it depends on who you ask. Some people will say, no, it is that same trunk that's now been reformed. I fall into the school of thought that says, no, that trunk, they just put a new sprout that came out. It's a new branch that came out. So to me, the Novus Ordo Missae is truly a new order of Mass, a new sprout that has come out. The trunk, from the trunk of the Roman rite. But again, we have many branches that come from the trunk of the Roman rite. I go to the Ordinariate. The Ordinariate is basically taking the English patrimony that was rooted in the Sarum rite of England, which actually was rooted in the Roman rite from St. Gregory and St. Augustine of Canterbury that were sent to England. So it developed. It's still a branch from the Roman rite that's going on. So that's where we kind of are. And depending on which liturgical scholar you're reading and consulting, some people have strong opinions otherwise. There are many who think, nope, the Novus Ordo Missae is the trunk that was reformed. That's why the traditional Roman Rite, the TLM, should be suppressed, because that is no longer, this is now the Roman Rite. I disagree with that. I think because of the way that it was done and promulgated, I think it's a sprout. I think it's a branch that's come out. I think the Roman Rite is still there and is what we know as the TLM. That's the trunk. I think the Novus Ordo Missae is a sprout.
So maybe a follow-up question that when you talk about the trunk versus the sprouts, and that there's, I guess, a couple of trunks, like you could talk about the Roman trunk and the Eastern various trunks. Does the church have the authority to sort of chop down a trunk? Like, could she just eliminate entirely, say, just the Roman Rite?
It's a great question. It's never been done. The church has suppressed branches, but the church has never suppressed a trunk. And by suppression, we mean stamp out, restrict, totally done. Church has never done that. Because it has what we in canonical term calls immemorial custom. Immemorial custom is something that goes all the way back. In other words, we trace it to ancient times. And if it's an immemorial custom, it lives on. So I think that's why the church, now if Rome came out and say, we are now suppressing the Roman Rite, meaning suppressing the trunk, or we're suppressing the Byzantine liturgy forever, that's it, it's done, I would highly question that as valid. Because me personally, I don't think the authority of the church has the right to suppress immemorial custom. But thankfully, that's never been done. We've never seen that. Because restriction is a big thing, and even Traditionis Custodes notice restricted. Even in 1970, Paul VI restricted it, but didn't say no more. There are still places where it was being allowed to continue. So even if you have one monastery of monks who are still celebrating, that immemorial custom, it's still in existence. That's going on. So right now we have a serious restriction of it, but it's not a suppression of the Roman Rite. And this is not me, by the way. This is Ratzinger. In 1988, when he came out with Summorum Pontificum, he explicitly states the Roman Rite has never been suppressed. In other words, this trunk has never been suppressed, which caused a lot of liturgical scholars to go crazy and everything, because one of the things that made it a little confusing is that the language that was used in the general instructions on the Roman Missal, the 1970 Mass, it can be read that it's being suppressed. But Ratzinger is saying, nope, that's a misreading of it. I look at it and I'm thinking, all right, I'll trust you, because in my reading of it, it seems to lean that way, but he's saying, nope, it has never been suppressed. And I think what he's getting at is it was always allowed. It's someplace. At the time, it was never completely stamped out. It was always officially allowed somewhere, and because of that, it's still in existence, and it's still, the church has never suppressed one of those trunks. Great question. Yeah.
So I have a question, and it's more in reference to. I hate microphones. It's probably more. It was more relevant last night, but I'm just curious. And I wrote it down because there are some things that shock me a little, and seeing this shocked me a bit. So it's very hard to articulate. But in some circles, I've seen a certain rise of anti-Semitism. What are the church's teachings on Judaism, and can one believe these conspiracies while still being a practicing Catholic?
Great question. Oh, it's always great to talk about conspiracy theories. The church's relationship, the church's teachings with our Jewish brothers and sisters versus how that relationship has been lived out has not always been consistent, admittedly so. First, let's look at what the church teaches about Judaism. The church looks at Judaism and sees Judaism as us. And what I mean by that is, if I look at a history, my history, our salvation history, what I see is the one family of God from creation all the way through the eschaton. In other words, when Jesus comes back and in the fulfillment. That's one family story of which I am a part. That family story has some serious ups and serious downs. It has serious, tensions. It has serious things that's going on through salvation history. Because of original sin and because of all of the halapu that happens there, the buildup is that God is going to take care of this problem of original sin, this problem of sin somehow. And as we were talking about beforehand, the kletos, the one who are being called out into holiness, that's the family of God. And so we see in history, the family of God became from the tribe of Eber, the Eberus, the Hebrews. And that's what we're tracing through Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and on through the 12 tribes of Israel, going into the kingdom of Israel and all that stuff. That becomes later on what's described as Judaism. Judaism is really just that family that was chosen, that family that was called out, the group that was called out. But the group that was called out, going back to Genesis 12, remember the 3 promises to Abraham? I would give you land, descendants, and then the third one is the all-important one in Genesis 12, that through you, the entire world will be blessed. Through you, the call is going to go out to the entire world to enter into this new and everlasting covenant. That's the goal of it. So this family is the called out ones that God's going to work through in order to bless, to call the entire human race, the entire humanity back to himself. So we're waiting on how that happens. Through the Old Testament, the waiting for the Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christos, the one that's going to make this happen. That comes in the person of Jesus Christ. We then follow Jesus Christ because that's the continuation, the fulfillment of the story. There are some groups that say, hey, he's not the one. The he's not the ones later on develop into what's now contemporary Judaism, which then split into all kinds of different groups as well. So the way that we look at Jews is just that. We are the same family. They're the ones that were prepared for. Jesus Christ came. He's the natural conclusion or the natural outgrowth, and that's the story that kept going on. I'm just stepping into that story and continuing it. Because I'm part of that story now, you're a part of that story now, we're stepping in it this time. There are those who diverge and say, nope, that's where we cut the line, that's where we draw it off. This Jesus thing, he was not the Messiah. So how do we view the Jewish ones who cut that off there and say, no? We said, hey, you're still our brothers and sisters because we have this common ancestry. Pope Pius XII said, and in the end, at root, we're all Jews. We're the same family. It's the same story that's going on, except now Judaism, as an ism now, as a religion now, is those who don't accept that. But if we reject Judaism in the sense of that history, we misunderstand Jesus Christ. One of the biggest things in biblical history in the last couple of decades, and I think a great development, is going back to the Jewish understanding and context of Jesus Christ, because that's where he came from. That's where it is. It's our story that's going on there. So that's the church's teachings on it. It's those who have, it's a belief that basically agrees up to the Jesus point and draws the line. Relationship-wise, then, there is no room for any type of anti-Semitism or any sort of racism or anything like that in general. The problem with anti-Semitism is that it gets kind of mixed up in what people mean by that. Is it anti-Semitism to say, hey, I think you're incorrect in not accepting Jesus Christ? I don't think that's anti-Semitism. Is it anti-Semitism to say, well, because the reason I reject you is because all of your people crucified Jesus Christ? That is anti-Semitism at that point. Second Vatican Council came along and said, in Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on Non-Christian Religion, that is an error. We do not transfer guilt of those who are working to get Jesus Christ crucified to an entire descendant of people like that. That's anti-Semitism that's going on. On the flip side, does that mean then we have to adopt Jewish customs to celebrate Seder meals and things like that? And the answer is no. To say we don't celebrate that, we don't do that, is not anti-Semitic. Because we believe that, hey, the Passover meal and the Seder meals has now become the Mass, has now become fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So while there's no room for anti-Semitism, that is absolutely deplorable, just like any sort of, and sometimes it gets tied in with racism and things like that. That's deplorable. That's absolutely against what we teach. On the flip side, sometimes things that we proclaim as Jesus Christ being the fulfillment, the Messiah, people see that as anti-Semitic, which is incorrect as well. So, thank you. Question?
So my second
okay.
question, sorry.
Sure.
My second question, I recently heard a friend use the word faggot in reference to a homosexual person or someone who's gay, whatever. And I was like, okay, that's a very pejorative term. Like, why would you use that? Excuse me, sorry. Yeah. And I'm just curious. Their defense was that Jesus called sinners sinners, so why can't I? Like, even if it's a pejorative term, like, why would that be an issue? So, what, what's something that I can come back to that? Like, how do you defend that then? In saying that, oh, this is the wrong thing to say, or is that just, something you can say?
It's always interesting when people bring up something like, well, Jesus overturned the tables, I can too. Jesus did, a whip of cords, I can too. Jesus called people names, so I can too. My response always is, are you going to go to the cross and rise also? Are you the chosen? Are you God also? In other words, if we get into that, it becomes a cover for just about everything or anything that we want to do that's wrong. The short answer is pejorative terms are not respecting the dignity of human persons. Pejorative terms like that for us to say is basically bringing an element of insult into the conversation already. Now, calling a spade, well, truth is not bound up in that term. As a matter of fact, I see very little truth in that term. That's a culturally bound term. That is a pejorative that people will take like that. There is nothing in advancing the kingdom in calling somebody that. When Jesus used terms, strong language sometimes, it was never pejorative terms. Even you brood of vipers, whitewash caskets and things like that, to us we're saying, hey, he's cussing them out. And the answer is, no, he was not cussing them out. He's describing an accurate reality, which in the divine pedagogy of Jesus Christ was the perfect thing to do at that time. We cannot say that of ourselves, because that is not what's going on when somebody is using a term like that. And it is not respecting the dignity of persons, and it kills the conversation. And quite frankly, they've done more damage to the church and to the truth in approaching it that way than not. Because, and I know this is kind of a out of nowhere, but to apply something like the just war theory, when do you argue? How do you argue? In the just war theory, we have certain things that we keep in mind. One, is it a defensive thing? Two, is it consistent? Is the response consistent with the attack? Third, is there possibility of winning? People forget that in a just war principle, you don't go to war unless there's a good possibility of a good outcome, even if you have the other elements. So in other words, even if I'm justified in going strongly against somebody in an argument, do I do that? Only if there's a good possibility of an outcome. When somebody uses a word like that, I guarantee you there's no possibility of a good outcome. So yeah, that's not what I was saying. Yes.
Okay, more on the Latin Mass here.
Yeah.
So, let's say, I'm just going to give you a hypothetical. Let's say you live in an area where the only Novus Ordo you can get to is very irreverent and just awful clown masses, that kind of thing. Where is it in canon law that, first of all, does a private Mass by a priest fulfill a Sunday obligation? And secondly, where does that put a priest in terms of obedience if they're praying a Latin Mass for you? Are they disobeying the bishop in that situation?
Yeah, great question. A tough question also. To this, I'll take the second one first, and then we'll go back to the first one. The second question is in terms of obedience. Traditione Summorum Pontificum, Benedict XVI back in 2007, allowed for the celebration of the TLM, the Judicial Latin Mass, the Roman Rite, without permission of the bishop or authority. In other words, every priest had the right to do it so long as he's able to do it and all that stuff. Which means that private masses always free. Now, certain masses that are public in places, then the permission has to be more for being able to have it at a public place, not being able to have it. So that's how Benedict parsed it. And in other words, it was pretty blanket allowance for it. I wish it were different, but Traditionis Custodes limited even private masses for the Roman Rite. I wish it were different. I think that's an unjust thing. It's almost as if it's more understandable regarding the public nature and the public masses of it. I still disagree, but that at least is a little bit more in keeping, I think. I think it's a little unjust, but it's also one of those things where the supreme authority has the right to do that. So if a priest under Traditionis Custodes is celebrating private Latin masses, private TLMs, I would have to say that that's going against the provisions in Traditionis Custodes at that time. Does going to a private mass satisfy the Sunday obligation? And the answer is yes, it does. Because the code simply says you satisfy the obligation by faithful attendance at a legitimate Roman rite. Or a legitimate rite of mass. It can be not just the Roman rite, but any rite of mass, legitimate rite. So yes, it satisfies the obligation, unless the church has somehow, someplace specifically says that this situation does not. So, for example, if I live in an area where there is no Catholic masses, like certain areas of Russia, for example, and I only have an Eastern Orthodox rite to go to, I may go to that and fulfill my Sunday obligation. I don't have to, but I may go to that and fulfill my Sunday obligation. That's because it's a specific situation. If, however, there's a Catholic church there, I have to go to that one because that's the obligation, the normal mode. When it comes to a situation where the only option is a Novus Ordo or some other mass that is outside of the box, outside of the bounds, in other words, of irreverence and things like that, the weighing starts coming in. Is it a valid mass? Is it, and what is the damage that's going on? There's not a bright line for that. And so it's a serious situation because the obligation is there, but the obligation, where do you draw that line? Church canon law doesn't drop a clear, bright line thing is there. So the implication is that we have an obligation to attend the valid Catholic Mass. At the point where I start doubting the validity of that Mass, or more specifically, the validity of the consecration, did the Mass take place? That's when I would have to start stepping back. Up to that point, though, I have the obligation to attend. What I'm sure going to do is I'm going to do it in a way that's going to protect the conscience of my children, the explanation, honest conversation that's going on that's put me in a horrible situation. I have people in our area who are driving 2 hours to get to a Mass. That's a suffering. That's tough because in conscience, they said, I can't go here. But if that's the case, it's just like civil disobedience. If we're going to make that decision in conscience, then we have to be willing to provide it otherwise. So if I said, hey, there's not a valid Mass, or there's not a Mass that I can in good conscience take my children to because of this and that and this and that, then I have to be willing to provide for my children in some other way to fulfill their obligation and mine. I wish cases were different, but I think that's where we are.
Use the word legitimate,
Yeah.
which is that's different from licit and valid.
No, it would be licit. Right. Legitimate would mean that it's by law. It's by law. So licit and valid is more specific designation of that, because obviously if something is invalid, it's also illegitimate. If something is illicit, then it's also illegitimate. So legitimacy is just kind of a blanket term that says according to the law. That's according to law.
Right. So then you can go to, if you don't have a licit and valid Mass, you can at least go to an illicit valid Mass, or you should go.
Yeah. Yes.
Because that would be the Orthodox Church.
The Orthodox Church,
Illicit, but
right?
it's valid.
That's right. Or, for example, let's say I have a parish that does all kinds of strange stuff, but the priest does the consecration. That's illicit, highly illicit, because he's skipping this and skipping that, but Jesus is showing up. In other words, Jesus is going to be there. And the suffering that I'm going through is nothing compared to the suffering that Jesus is going through and that he already saw in the garden. So yes, if I'm going to a Mass that is illicit but legitimate, in other words, valid, that is preferable than not going at all.
So is it kind of, then what would you respond to an argument then? Well, SSPX is illicit but valid. no sort of Latin mass illicit was valid, plus horrible, what would you say then? Oh, we'll just go to SSPX because both are illicit, even though this is under the authority of, seems to be more illicit, arguably, than SSPX. What would be, how should we think of those two cases?
Yeah, well, great question. It's a great example. So if we're looking at the SSPX, for example, the SSPX, the problem that I have right now is that Rome has been even more confusing about the situation. It's clear that the SSPX is in some sort of irregular communion with the church. That that's something that's not right there. Now, people are going to disagree about what that is and everything, but at the end of the day, everybody agrees that's not the way it's supposed to be. So, given that, what the church is saying is that, okay, that's in a sense an illegitimate situation that's going on there because they're not in full communion in the sense of fully accepting the authority of the church and things like that. That leads some people to say that they are in schism. Other people say they're not. What confuses the matter more now is that under Pope Francis himself, SSPX priests are given the faculty, the ability to absolve sins validly in confession, which means I can go to an SSPX priest for confession and be perfectly valid, licit, and legitimate. That's going on. That was done in the year of mercy back in 1415, and then Francis continued that even to this day. Francis has also allowed marriages to validly happen in SSPX forms and chapels. Before it was not, because marriage requires a faculty, and SSPX priests did not have the faculty to do that. There's arguments on the SSPX side of saying how they do. I think some of those fall really short. Outside of that, though, Rome has allowed that. So I can go to SSPX marriages. I can even get married in an SSPX chapel now, validly, licitly, and legitimately. So that, I think, is a good development, but honestly, it's also a confusing development that's happened here because there's an irregular communion situation that's going on, irregular, relationship with the church situation that's going on. But yet, two things specifically has been allowed by Francis himself in that situation. So you can see where this becomes confusing for the faithful. Well, what about attending masses then at that point? This too becomes a little bit confused. The normal, or the default position is that, hey, because of the irregular communion situation, we should not attend that. Just like all things being equal, I shouldn't attend an Eastern Orthodox Mass as my satisfaction for my obligation, my Sunday obligation that's going on. If there's a crazy Catholic Mass that's going on and a reverent Eastern Orthodox Byzantine liturgy that's going on, I'm going to want to go to the Byzantine liturgy, but I'm under obligation to go to the Catholic Mass that's going on. So, at what point does this trump that? There's not a clear line that's going on there. That being said, all things being equal in themselves, my obligation is to attend the legitimate Catholic Mass that's there, because the communion with the SSPX is, by everybody's agreement, some sort of an irregular communion situation. There is a scandal aspect also. I think that's one of the things that's causing this, is because there's scandal in many ways. If I all of a sudden start attending SSPX chapels on a regular basis, I'm causing more of the confusion that's going on. I'm adding to the scandal. Because then what I'm thinking is, oh, it's just me now. It's just me, my kids, and that's it. That's what I'm worried about. Yes, but that's not all you should be worried about. Are you contributing to a deeper misunderstanding of the situation of the church? And I would say yes. Even with good intentions, going to an SSPX chapel on a regular basis contributes to more misunderstanding in the church under the guise of that is better for me.
Just last thing.
Yeah.
You use the words, there is a doubt about the schismatic nature of SSPX. I don't doubt whether they're in a schism or not, because for me it's very clear that, or I thought it was clear, and you're the one who actually knows about this.
Yeah.
Schism doesn't come from, schism doesn't happen, I guess it can happen for both sides, but the fact that the Pope grants faculties doesn't undo a schism, right?
Nope.
Because schism is the rejection of the head, the rejection of the Pope. The fact that the SPX falls out of all the hierarchy structure of the church, that's what causes the schism.
Yeah.
So ostensibly, the Pope could, this is like saying, the Pope could say, oh, if you go to confession to Orthodox, that's valid, illicit, married, not illicit. And they're like, oh, the Orthodox aren't schism anymore. And the Orthodox would be like, well, no, we are, because that's an us, we reject the hierarchy of the Pope. And even as PX, you say, well, they say the Pope and everything. Yeah, but they reject the authority because it's super easy for them to say that tomorrow they can say, all right, we fall under the church, we accept it, then the dominoes fall, and that would be amazing.
Yeah.
So none of those things that they mentioned really affect the schismatic nature of it, right? Or is that not a good way to think of it?
No, I think that's a very good way to do it. And if you notice, I chose my terms very carefully also, because when we talk about schism, which is really Canon 751, where it lays out the definition of heresy, schism, and apostasy, the something like the SSPX is schismatic in nature. Canonically, however, there has never been a declaration of schism from the church. So we have a de facto schism, I think. I don't see a formal declaration of schism. And so what happens is that people on the different camps then, the people who agrees, such as myself, that agrees that this is schismatic, it's a schismatic group. People say, well, they're in schism then. Well, what do you mean? Do you mean that it's been officially declared as such? Or is that they're doing schismatic things? They're certainly doing schismatic things. I think the nature of it is very schismatic. But I don't see a declaration of schism. That being said, on the flip side then, some SSPXers and others would say, well, because there's no declaration of schism, we're not in schism. And the answer is, well, you're in de facto schism, you're not in de jure schism. Because under Canon 17, it says that anything that restricts a right must be interpreted strictly. In other words, my strict interpretation then has to kick in before we say somebody's been declared in schism, which means I got to see a document. I got to see a declaration from the authority of the church who can do that, declaring that they are in schism. Now, in 98, 99, something like that, I forget, or late 90s there, Archbishop Bruskowitz in Lincoln, Nebraska, declared several groups in schism, one of which was like the Masonic groups and things like that. He added the Society of St. Pius X. Can Bruskowitz do that? And the answer is for his diocese, he could do that. They were formally de jure in schism in the Diocese of Lincoln at that time. That has not been done for the church in general. Rome has never issued a declaration, a formal declaration of schism. That's where the confusion comes in. But I think it's wrong for the SSPX and others who support them to say, well, in that case, we're not in schism. That's a big difference. That's a big difference because if we say that, Rome has never declared all kinds of liberal groups in schism either. But it's clear that some of those groups are schismatic in nature and are not in good communion with the church. I think that's where we find ourselves with the SSPX. That situation is that I think it is schismatic in nature without a formal declaration of schism having been done. I think it would have been much more merciful for the church to actually clarify that one way or the other, to say they're not in schism. The granting of the faculty for confession and for marriages, I think, while doing some good, confuses the things a little bit more. Because that is one of the arguments, and certainly not mine, but certainly one of the arguments is, well, how can you be in schism if you're given faculties? Well, we do that to Orthodox priests as well. We do that to other groups who are in partial communion with valid sacraments. We do that all the time. It can be done. It doesn't mean that it's not schismatic in nature. That being said, I don't see a formal declaration of schism that I've been able to find. Yeah. Great question.
So one question I have is, so I have some family members who are Catholic and they, it's like support abortion. It's like, what would be the best course of action to go about that? I was just like talking about it.
Yeah, the first thing to go about it is the conversation, the relational aspect
Yeah.
of it. Now, obviously, it depends on what your relationship is. So if you have a bad relationship with a family member already, throwing a discussion about abortion into it is probably just going to blow things up and make things worse. You may not be the right person to engage in that. So that has to be weighed, first of all. Okay. So if certain family members are there, the first thing to gauge is, what is my relationship with that person? Meaning, what is my interaction? What can be said? Am I the person that has a chance to be able to reach this person one way or the other? Sometimes we sit back and we say, hey, that's my brother, that's my sister, that's my cousin, or whatever, it's my parents, whatever. But if I bring it up, it's not going to work. It's probably going to try, and it's going to be a big argument because we don't have that relationship set yet. So in other words, what's the relationship that's set first? Is there a possibility of being able to engage in that? And if there is, then gently but clearly start to engage in that. Yeah.
Doctor, I was slow on the uptake. Could you rewind your comment about private Latin masses and their validity and illicitness, please?
Sure. Right now, what we have in the church, situation in the church is, under Summorum Pontificum in 2007, Benedict XVI allowed for the traditional Roman rite to be celebrated, and no priest needed a permission to celebrate it privately. And private masses is, just that. It's something that he's celebrating privately. It's not something that's advertised. It's not something that people come to. It's just his own mass. That's fine. Under Traditionis Custodes, that has clearly been taken away. And the provision is that even private TLMs are restricted. In other words, a priest does not have the ability to celebrate the TLM even privately as mass.
Not even his own private chapel in his rectory or his town home?
That's how I read it. Yeah, and the language, and I've searched to try to see, okay, is there something that's clearly what they intended? That's clearly the language that's there. I think it's a really imprudent decision. So under Canon 212, Section 3, very respectfully, I think that was an ill-informed decision and should be revoked. But I can't say that that's not the decision that's there. It's clear that that's what that document means.
They get the permission from their bishop, or does the bishop have to go to Rome for
In the clarification, the responsa dubium, Rome has reserved that to himself. The bishop cannot give that permission. Yeah, it's a very bizarre situation in the church. I think it's very overly restrictive at this point. This is why also a lot of times when, and we're getting this down in Texas a little bit too, there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of discontentment directed towards the bishops at this point. And some bishops are the ones that's going in and doing it, but other bishops, and a lot of them are not going to say it, but a lot of them have done what the document has called them to do and requested it from Rome. Because Rome has to give, they've reserved that dispensation to themselves. And so the bishop rightfully said, hey, can I have it at parish A, parish B, and this site? If Rome comes back and says no, the bishop has to implement that. And again, bishops are gentlemen a lot of times. They're not going to say, hey, Rome told me to do this. They don't want to do that. So they just make the decision. A lot of times it seems their decision, but a lot of times it's because they've asked permission and not gotten it.
So what are the practical consequences of private Latin masses? I mean, they're not publicly promoted, but one would have to live under a rock to not understand that in most every diocese in the country, there are priests celebrating the traditional Latin Mass in what they're referring to as private masses, which sometimes can be private for dozens of people. And what are the practical consequences of the attendees of that Mass and the priest who celebrates that Mass? What's your take on
My take on it is that it's a valid Mass. My take on it, because it's a valid Mass, it satisfies the obligation to attend a valid Mass because the requirements are such, and again, under strict interpretation of Canon 17, it satisfies the obligation, but it is not licit in the sense that that is, and I would say, and people would disagree with me, I know many people who would disagree with me, but I think because it's pretty clear what Traditionis Custodes is saying. Again, I disagree, but it's saying that I can't get around the fact that this is what is regulated. The intention of the legislator is to restrict that.
Is it sinful?
The answer is, it can be. That's the good lawyerly answer. And the reason I said under face situation, the answer is yes, it would be sinful. The sin would be the disobedience that's going on there. Because we're called to not only uphold the legitimacy, in meaning the validity of things, we're called also to uphold the licetiety of things. Knowing that, if I participate in a traditional Latin Mass that's private like that, knowing that, hey, this priest has been restricted from doing that, knowing that the idea and the letter and the law and the spirit of Traditionis Custodes is to restrict that, is for me not to go to that, and I say, I'm going to do it anyway, that's a clear act of disobedience on my part. And with that informed consent, if I know it, will it, and do it, it becomes sinful. Other people are still struggling with it. Other people are in conscience, don't know about it or something like that. The culpability can be lessened depending on the situation. But objectively speaking, for me to totally disregard a clear teaching and clear regulation of the church, even though I highly disagree with it, would be sinful. Yeah. I wish it were otherwise.
What do you make of the people who say, well, it's an unjust law, so I don't need to follow this because it's not just?
Yeah. St. Thomas defines the unjust law as not something that's imprudent or something we disagree with. And that's where I think a lot of times our strong disagreement with something creates a temptation to say, well, it's now unjust. There's a big difference between unjust in and of itself and something that has bad effects on me. There could be a just law that has really bad effects on people. The bad effect doesn't make it an unjust law. An unjust law must be something that is immoral in the sense of clearly against faith and morals, and then, or something that is outside of the jurisdictional authority of the lawgiver to make. And some people would say, well, this is immoral, what he's doing. Not really. He does have that authority to do that. So for example, the same people who would say that would say, well, Rome then needs to suppress the Novus Ordo. You're basically saying that Rome has the authority to do that. So the question then is, can we suppress the Novus Ordo Mass? And if we say, yeah, Rome should and can, well, then Rome can also restrict the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass as well. It can cut both ways, in other words. So I don't think it falls under the definition of an unjust law. I think it falls under a highly imprudent law that has some really bad spiritual effects even. I don't think it's helping the salvation of souls. But that means it's an imprudent law. It doesn't mean that it's an unjust law.
But is it prudence a virtue, like a moral virtue that would need to be followed? If you're doing something that's imprudent, would that still be immoral?
It can be. It can be. But that doesn't fall into the definition of unjust law then. That's outside. That's a culpability question that's going there. That's a different type of question that's going there. Can the Pope do it? That's the question. So, for example, let's say, can I restrict my children from eating vegetables? Now, if I did that, that's a highly imprudent thing to do. If I told, kids, you're not allowed to, the kids who are still under my care, not you, but the kids who are under my care, no more vegetables. I restrict you from doing that. I have the authority to give that order to them. Is that an unjust law? No, I have that authority not to provide vegetables anymore. Now, I'm failing in general nutrition and things like that, but the kids can't just say, you can't tell me to do that. I can tell you to do that. But it's highly unjust, and I'm going to have all kinds of things to answer for. But we can't say that I didn't have the authority to just stop buying vegetables.
So is there a distinction between your personal morality and the legitimacy of your actions?
We call it culpability, right? Culpability that's going on. The culpability, just like in moral theology, we separate, the action from the culpability. So if somebody sinning because they are, suffering from an addiction, it's still objectively sinful, but the culpability may be lessened. In the same way, somebody who's not Catholic, not Christian, doesn't know sexual morality and things like that, who are living out what we would say is immoral sexual activities, is that still sinful? And the answer is that's sinful, yeah. We can't say that's not sin. but they may be held to a lesser culpability because they didn't understand or didn't know the principles of sin and morality and things like that. So that is the difference there. The legislator, all the way up to the Pope, has to consider what is able to be done. And then on a culpability side, is it moral for him? Is it morally culpable for him to do that? I can do a lot of legitimate things that are bad, that have bad results that are there. And we see that with attorneys all the time. I mean, in my field, we see attorneys doing a lot of things that they know they can do, but they're doing it for a whole different purpose and a whole different thing. Legally, yeah, they're able to do that, but that's a pretty, cruddy thing to do. There's a culpability that's going on there. I think with this situation with the liturgy, we're in a similar situation where it's highly imprudent. It's having terrible spiritual effects, I think, on people. But can it be done? Is it legitimate? Is it licit? I can't see how it's not licit.
I want to make an analogy to the civil law, which you said don't do.
Yeah.
Well, let's say the enshrining of abortion. It's given by a legitimate authority, a legitimate legislator, but we call it an unjust law because of its effect.
No, we call it an unjust law because of its nature. The authority does not have the ability to enshrine murder. That's why it's unjust, because the nature of the thing itself is such that is immoral. So that would be the difference there. Now, what you're seeing also in a lot of states and places, to carry on the analogy a little bit, is that even though it's restricted, people are trying to get around it with all these different ways that may be licit, maybe not. Driving across state line, things like that. That's still a culpability that's going on there, but they're following the letter of the law. The other difference with the analogy is that civil law is based on a positivism, what they call a positivism. In other words, legitimacy in civil law is based on procedural. If you follow the procedure correctly and the one that has legitimate authority follows the procedure, it's legitimate, nothing else to consider. For us, it's like there's a little bit more to consider because we see there are certain things that are out of bounds of that person's authority. We call it jurisdiction. It seems like a dry term, but if you're acting outside of jurisdiction, then that's an invalid law. So in civil society, you're acting outside of jurisdiction if you're legislating for somebody outside of your district, outside of your state, or something like that. For us, the authority, the jurisdiction is more than just that. It also falls under what kinds of things that are going in there. Is that kind of thing in and of itself immoral? So we apply that to the restriction of the TLM. Is restriction of a legitimate right in the Catholic Church, is that in and of itself immoral outside the bounds of a legislator like the Pope to do? And the answer is no, it's within his ability to do that.
We'll do one more question, and then we'll stop the recording.
Very unrelated. Very unrelated, but I've been wondering about it for a while. What is the difference between the imprimatur and the nihil obstat of Catholic books, and what do they actually do or indicate about the book?
Yeah, the imprimatur and the nihil obstat. So sometimes when you look at the beginning of Catholic books, you'll see a nihil obstat and an imprimatur. And the easiest way to explain it is to look at the procedure. The procedure is that under the old code, under the 17 code, anything about faith and morals, about the Catholic faith, has to be given the permission for it to be printed. The current legislation tweaks that just a little bit. The current legislation under the 83 code says, okay, writers, you can write what you want. But if you write something that is a textbook for religion, theology, and things like that, if you write something that is about scripture or canon law, translation of scripture, those types of things, you have to get the permission of the church to print that. How does that work? If I write, let's say I want to write a book on, canon law for seminarians, a textbook. Clearly, I'm going to need an imprimatur for that, a permission for that. The way it works is this. I submit it to my ordinary, meaning the bishop. I have two choices on which bishop that is. I can go to my own bishop, the one that has authority over me, or I can go to the bishop of the place where it's being printed. So let's say I write a book on canon law. I can either go to Cardinal Donardo in Houston, who's in jurisdiction I live in, Or let's say Ignatius Press wants to print it. I can go to Archbishop Cordileone out in San Francisco and ask him for the permission to print it. So let's say I ask Cardinal Donardo, Cardinal, Your Eminence, I've written this textbook and I'm seeking permission for it to be printed. He'll say, great, we'll take that, we'll get back to you. The bishop then takes that and he gives it out to and assigns a person that's called a censor librorum, a person who checks through books. That censor librorum is usually somebody with an expertise in that subject matter. The censor librorum goes through and he reads it and he checks it, but he only checks it for doctrinal accuracy. He doesn't check it for that you're putting it in the best way. He doesn't check the fact that I like you or not. He only checks, hey, is this doctrinally compatible with what the church teaches? Is this inside the bounds? I know because I've been assigned to be censor librorum on several projects, several things. So bishops have over the years given me stuff, hey, can you read this and give me your opinion on it? And I read it and I tell you, sometimes I go back and I said, okay, Bishop, I find nothing doctrinally objectionable in here, but I gotta tell you, this is a god-awful writer. He doesn't know his stuff. Yeah, all of that is outside the point though. The only thing I'm checking for is whether or not it's doctrinally accurate. That's the fair thing to do. And so what the censor librorum does then is that the censor librorum gives back to the bishop with his opinion. And his opinion is either, hey, we got some problems here, Bishop. We have to go back and talk to the guy to correct this and make suggestions on it. Or I can say there is nothing objectionable. Nothing objectionable means there's nothing obstructing it to go forward. The term for that is nihil obstat. Nothing obstructs. And so if you open a book, a lot of times, you'll see nihil obstat and then a name. That name is the censor librorum. So there are books floating out there that says nihil obstat Ben Nguyen, because I'm the one that gave the opinion that says there's nothing objectionable for this. The bishop takes that, if he has the nihil obstat from his censor, he takes that and he said, oh, it may be printed. The Latin word for it may be printed, which is a perfect passive subjunctive, imprimatur. That's what the word imprimatur means. It may be printed. And so he gives that stamp of approval there. So you usually see two things on there, nihil obstat and imprimatur. Nihil obstat is the guy that reviews it. Imprimatur is the ecclesial authority that allows it to go forward to be printed. If the author is a religious, so let's say Father John here writes a book on a certain saint or something like that, and he writes it as a textbook or something, he needs to also get what's called an imprimi potest. It can be printed from his superior. So if you open the book and you see imprimi potest, that means that the author is from a religious community, and he needed to get the permission from his superior. So you'll see three things in there: imprimi potest, and the name of the religious superior, nihil obstat, the censor, and then imprimatur, usually the bishop that's on there. What does that mean? Does that mean that it's a perfect Catholic book and reliable? And the answer is nope. What that means is in the opinions of these three people, it's okay. That's all it means. So you see some books with imprimaturs that are god-awful and actually are incorrect. But that just means the censor librorum had the wrong opinion on it. Imprimaturs never means that this is sanctioned by the church. It doesn't mean that. It just means that according to this guy, he didn't see anything problematic with it. And according to this bishop, based on that, it can be printed. Yeah. Sometimes people make a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less about what those imprimaturs mean. It's the opinion of this guy, the opinion of the bishop, that it can be printed. Yeah. Great question. Thank you very much.